The traditional manufacture of a Japanese sword is an example of what is possible without any modern technology. The development of high-carbon steel through primitive means is remarkable, but what's truly amazing is how far the sword came from its inception. What we think of today as a katana is in fact a very particular example in the long history that makes up the sword. The first Japanese swords were in fact quite primitive, but each new development was a stepping stone on the path to what many consider the perfect sword. The first swords made in Japan, jokoto, or ancient swords, were produced between the 4th and 10th century. They were initially poor imitations of Korean and Chinese blades, usually very straight and long, known generically as tachi or long swords. These represented the first steps to today's katana. Very little from this era has survived, but those that remain have mostly been discovered in burial mounds and were simple ceremonial weapons, but were quite practical. It took nearly 600 years for the sword to see a major change. But in this period, the blacksmiths learned much, and eventually, the Japanese tachi was at least as good as its Chinese and Korean counterparts. During the Heian period, large-scale warfare became especially prevalent, and with the addition of cavalry, a sword with curvature was required. The earlier swords had been designed mostly for stabbing, which was very difficult from horseback. This developed into a sword with a deep curve near the tsuka, or handle, and a much gentler curve towards the kisaki, or tip. These swords were often even longer than their predecessors, sometimes having a cutting edge exceeding 4 feet. At a glance, these blades seem remarkably similar to what we are familiar with, but were usually worn edge down and attached by a rope to the belt. The Shinto period represents a full half of the swords in existence today. The relative peace for much of this period, 1530 to 1867, helps to explain much of the transition from combat to art. Many changes resulted from this peace. First and foremost, the blade was shortened, sometimes to less than 2 feet. The sword also began to be carried between layers in nobi, a long sash-like belt used to keep a kimono closed. The longer there was peace, the more elaborate the decorations on the sword became. Engravings of dragons and flowers replaced strength and flexibility. The art of creating an elaborate hamon flourished. The hamon were temper lines that were the result of differentially tempered steel, allowing a hard edge while maintaining a flexible blade. The late Shinto period's hamon became so elaborate, mulberry leaves, or an accurate rendering of Mount Fuji, would sometimes be painstakingly rendered. The development of the katana we know today was more than just technical advances. Since its first use in ceremonies, it was held spiritual significance. Not only is the sword one of the 3 emblems of the Shinto faith, there are many examples of Buddhist writings. Over 1,000 years of history is behind the making of the sword we see today. It was an important part of Japanese history, as well as an essential element to the Shinto religion. It went from a poorly made replica to one of the most advanced swords to have ever been created.